Good morning, afternoon, and hello. I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar this morning, Sexual Harassment Prevention Training at Nonprofits. My name is Max Smith. I'm the Communications Director for 501c Services. As most of you all know, we are a 100% employee-owned company that provides alternatives to state-run unemployment insurance programs. We have about 1,500 nonprofits nationally that work with us. Among part of our program, we are the administrator of the 501c Agencies Trust. We also offer a Boy Scouts unemployment program. We work with the Boy Scouts nationally. And we also have a standalone product, a first dollar unemployment insurance program that we call You Insure. Like I said, many of you all on the program this morning are already working with us, and we look forward to working with you all some more in the future. Now, I have a couple of housekeeping items before I turn this over to our presenter today, Emily May. We will be taking questions as we go, but we'll be holding them to the end. So if Emily covers something and you want to ask a question about it, please go ahead and shoot it to me, and then we will address them during a Q&A portion at the end of the program. The materials are already available in the handout section of your GoToWebinar platform. Just go down to handouts. There's a PDF there. I think Emily did make a couple of updates, so it won't be an exact match of what you will see on the screen, but it will be very close. And that deck will also be emailed to you later today, so you'll have two ways to get it. For those of you all on the webinar today who are after the HRCI or SHRM HR credits, you all know the deal with those. There'll be a post-event poll that will pop up when we end the webinar. You need to complete that for me. There will also be a copy of that poll in the post-event email, so you can find it there. You just need to indicate on that poll which credit you need, and I will get that back to you as quickly as possible. Also, another added thing in today's poll for everybody, even if you're not getting credits, we do ask you a couple of questions about sexual harassment prevention at your organizations. We're trying to collect a little bit of data about the audience, how you all deal with these issues at your organization. So if you don't mind, at the end, take a moment and answer those 3 or 4 questions for us so we know better what you all need. We have a webinar next month on June 26th. There'll be a link to that in your post-event email. It's on workplace violence prevention at nonprofits. So this month we're doing sexual harassment, and next month we're doing workplace violence. A little bit of overlap, but not a lot. So please join us next month as well. Now, I am done, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Emily May. She's the Executive Director at Hollaback. About 15 years ago, she co-founded Hollaback, and since that time, 2005, the organization has grown to about 50 cities in 25 different countries. And Emily, I'm going to try to share this with you since Nate signed in under Emily as well. Tell me if you don't see the link pop up, Emily.
I don't see it yet.
See if that did it.
See Nate's screen. Let me try the other. There you go.
Okay, great.
How about that one?
Yeah. All right. Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Mac, and hello to everyone out there across the country. It's great to get to spend some time with you all today. So we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, and we're going to zero in a little bit on what that looks like in the nonprofit context, because there are some specific opportunities and also some specific challenges in the nonprofit context. What we want to go through today, I'm going to give a short presentation, and the bulk of our time is going to be dedicated to questions. So as Max said, if you have questions, go ahead and throw those into the chat box as we go, and Mac will be DJing this once we get through the short presentation, and I'll be taking all your questions. So we want to explore a snapshot of what sexual harassment looks like in the workplace. We're going to quickly talk about those challenges and opportunities I mentioned that are specific specific to the nonprofit sector and things that you should be aware of. We're also going to talk about some of the legislative trends and policy changes that are happening. We've seen a tremendous amount of movement on this issue in this post-Me Too era that we're living in, and we're continuing to see policy changes happening on this issue on a regular basis. So we are going to go through some of those updated laws, but we're also going to talk about what the trends are in training. As many of you know, sexual harassment trainings have been around for a long time and are not always effective. So we're going to talk about what an effective training can look like and what an ineffective training can look like, so that you all can make sure that you're not wasting your time and your money with ineffective trainings. And then, of course, we're going to allow a big chunk of time for Q&A as well. So a little bit about Hollaback. We are a global people-powered movement to end harassment. We started off focusing on street harassment, then pivoted to online harassment, and then to look at workplace harassment as well. We are really looking at harassment across all forms of public spaces and recognizing that they do have a similar root cause, right? Which is sexism and racism and homophobia, and those things can show up in any space. Although all spaces, have their unique challenges and opportunities in terms of addressing harassment. We have young leaders all around the world leading this movement as part of our training and methodology, and we've collected over 13,000 stories of harassment and mapped them across the globe since we started. We started this work around, bystander intervention in particular, really looking for a community-based solution to harassment. So often when we talk about, harassment that happens in the workplace, it's very much the pressure is put on management or on HR to solve for the problem. And certainly management and HR has a, significant role in addressing the problem. But putting the sort of power and control solely with management and HR, what we found was really disempowering for everyday folks who were also committed to ending harassment, but didn't know how to do that in the context of a workplace where there's issues of power and relationships at play. And so this training has trained probably over 15,000 people. Our bystander intervention training, we've trained over 15,000 people with it at this point, and really started to see movement on it, bystander intervention in the workplace in particular, and it's starting to be identified as a promising practice. So quickly, let's look at this issue of sexual harassment. What the EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has found is that 1 in 4 women reported experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace. This data is recent. What I can tell you is sad about this data point is that this data point was the exact same in the 80s when there was a tremendous amount of movement around addressing sexual harassment. And of course, we all remember Anita Hill being a touchstone in that movement and in that body of work. So we really haven't seen a significant shift here, despite this issue being addressed and trainings existing for the past 20, 30, 40 years. And we also know that when harassment happens across the board, that sexual harassment is just part of it, right? That harassment can also happen on the basis of race, disability, age, etc. And I think it's important to acknowledge here that oftentimes sexual harassment can be coupled with other forms of harassment. Sexual harassment can be racist or ableist or ageist at the same time as it is sexual harassment. And so we can't just singularly look at the idea of sex or gender when we talk about sexual harassment. If we want to be able to see the complete problem, we have to also be able to see the complete person being harassed and how the complexity of their identities are at interplay. So, one question that we get really often is, what are some of these specific challenges that are unique to the nonprofit sector. And I would love for you all to talk about this too in the chat box and some of the things that you all have seen. We have trained a number of nonprofits in sexual harassment and bystander intervention training across the country, and we've seen a few separate trends here. First, the opportunities. You know, one of the things that I think is a significant opportunity is that women do hold many leadership roles in the nonprofit sector. And what we do see is that when women are put in charge, that it does help to reduce rates of sexual harassment and improve sexual harassment policies. We also have a sector that tends to attract people who value equity in the workplace and who share, you know, a set of values that we all deserve to be here. We all deserve to be ourselves while we're at work. The challenges are, you know, because of that set of shared values and that set of shared expectations, the expectations are higher than fields that may be dominated by men, or for example, construction or finance, and that expectation, you know, is important, right? Because when sexual harassment happens in our offices, we feel not just unsafe, but also somewhat betrayed, right? That here we are doing this work. If we're not safe here in this office, where actually are we safe? And there's a high expectation on management to handle what is almost always a messy situation with a high degree of integrity. And it's hard to get this right. It's hard to do it right. Almost every situation of sexual harassment is complicated. We're also challenged because we have less resources to get access to quality training on how to prevent sexual harassment. Many people I know at nonprofits, you know, will get a 15-minute e-learning where they quickly, you know, click through some slides and answer some pop quizzes, and are done, right? And a box is checked and nothing is changed. Ultimately, those types of trainings we find don't prevent sexual harassment. They purely help organizations to be in compliance with the sexual harassment laws that are popping up around the country, which doesn't help, right? We don't just want, you know, to avoid legal liability. We actually want to address the problem at its root and build workplaces that are safe for everyone. And the last piece here, and this can happen in any workplace, but does tend to happen in a severe way in nonprofits because of our values, and also because many of our nonprofits are small, intimate environments. You know, they tend to be operated more like families than like a cutthroat employer, for example. And these allegations can quickly erode trust and morale. In most situations, you know, there are a number of people who will believe both sides, right? And a number of people who will feel betrayed by no matter what the outcome is. And so I think that at the same time that we look to reduce instances of sexual harassment, we also have to be thoughtful, not just about what the laws are regarding sexual harassment, but also what we need to do as managers and as HR professionals to help to rebuild trust and morale in the face of these instances. The impacts of harassment on employees are significant. We see psychological and mental health impacts such as anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. We see some of the social and financial impacts. Oftentimes, we'll see people who won't report harassment per se. They'll just leave their job, leaving the person doing the harassing in place to harass the next person. We'll hear stories of people who, you know, are maybe harassed on their way to work, which is not necessarily part of the employer liability, but nonetheless starts to affect their ability to concentrate at work. And broadly, we see, you know, a quality of life being impacted. You may experience harassment, you may not report it, and you may keep your job, right? But slowly, your sense of self, your sense of community inside of your organization, and your productivity start to drop. And your organization can be held liable. While I don't go through the specifics of how sexual harassment is defined from a legal standpoint in this webinar, there is a legal definition here, and your organization can be held liable if it meets that legal definition of either creating a hostile work environment or having quid pro quo harassment, which essentially means, trading sexual favors or the acceptance of sexual harassment, or not talking about sexual harassment in exchange for being able to keep your job, or in exchange for a raise or a promotion. And the organization can be held liable, if harassment is committed by a supervisor, obviously, but also if it's committed by coworkers or an agent of the employer. So it could be someone that you hire externally. And I think particularly for direct service nonprofits, it's important to note that it can also you can also be held liable if your customers or your clients are harassing your employees. Similarly, at events such as if you were to have events outside of the office and your employees were to get harassed at those events that they were required to go to for work, even if it is, a happy hour or a company party, again, your organization can also be held liable in those situations. And we're seeing a number of laws mandating sexual harassment training popping up all around the country, heavily focused on the coast where you see these giant stars, but really starting to see it trend, as a solution, as a preventative solution to addressing sexual harassment. And quickly, I want to go through and just look at what some of those laws are shaping up to be, because they are very different from state to state. Again, this deck will be later be available after the training, so you do not need to quickly, jot down your state's laws, and certainly not all states have laws, but here are a few of them, right? So California and New York have some of the most stringent of the sexual harassment training laws. California, they want to see at least 2 hours of sexual harassment training to all supervisory employees and 1 hour to non-supervisory employees within 6 months of assumption of their position, right? And then you have to re-up it every 2 years. Colorado, it's just encouraged, right? Connecticut, it's only for supervisors. Delaware, it's all employees within 1 year of beginning employment. And many of these states too are applying it only to employers with a certain threshold of a number of employees. So in Delaware, it's only applying to employers with 50 or more employees in Delaware. Maine, again, they want to see all employees within 1 year. Massachusetts, same thing. New York State requires an annual sexual harassment prevention training. New York City requires that people are trained within 90 days of starting their employment. Rhode Island, again, within 1 year, and Vermont, again, within 1 year. And then we also see inside of that, certain areas and locations like New York City, for example, are mandating that certain things exist inside the training. So for example, mandating that the training is interactive, mandating that the training includes examples. And in New York City, it's the first city in the country to actually mandate that the training includes bystander intervention, which is a best practice that we're going to dive into in just a minute. This quote here is from the EEC, and what they're saying is, while traditional sexual harassment methods have failed, referring to those trainings that we've all gone through and have been the brunt of jokes for the past 20, 30, 40 years, the EEOC is finding that bystander intervention training shows significant promise for preventing harassment in the workplace, which is ultimately the goal. I think all of us know by the time harassment happens, it's already impacting morale. It's already taking time away from your important mission in the world. So prevention should ultimately be the goal of any training. And so what's the difference between traditional and bystander intervention training? So traditional sexual harassment training, the goal really is around reducing employer liability. I told you what the rules are, here they are, here's who to contact. It's not our fault if it still happens, right? Whereas bystander intervention training is much more focused on organizational culture. Build an organizational culture where we're all responsible for nipping what may not even rise to the level of harassment, what may just be, a microaggression, or maybe, passive aggressive teasing that becomes loaded with time. How do we address those things as an organization to ensure that it never escalates to the point of harassment? Traditional sexual harassment training is obviously going to give legal definitions of harassment. A bystander intervention training too will give you legal definitions, but also talk about what kinds of microaggressions can erode organizational culture. Traditional sexual harassment training encourages, reporting to management and government agency, and will certainly give employees the contact information for all of those things. Bystander intervention training, we want people to be armed with that too, but we also want to empower employees to actively reinforce norms and values. And at Hollaback, we have a methodology called the 5 Ds, which I'm going to go into in just a second. But briefly, it's direct intervention. And then we have 4 different forms of indirect intervention, including delegate, distract, document, and delay. All right, so here are those 5 Ds of bystander intervention. I'm going to go through them one by one and explain what they can look like in the workplace. So direct is the one that everyone thinks about, right? And direct, if you're in a managerial position, can be an incredibly important and necessary tool. Oftentimes for folks who are not in managerial positions, they have varying degrees of comfort with direct intervention. If the person doing the harassing is a peer or somebody that they feel comfortable with, they might feel comfortable directly intervening. If it is a supervisor, they may feel less comfortable, right? But direct intervention is just clearly saying, that's not what we stand for here. Stereotypes like that don't belong here. They don't belong in this workplace. Distract, an indirect method to de-escalating the situation. So here you're really trying to get the person being harassed out of the situation to stop the harassment, from occurring further. So, asking the person being harassed, could you help me solve a problem at my desk, right? Or I need you over here. And then checking in with them and seeing what can be done next. And I'm just going through these briefly. Obviously, the training is a little more robust than this, but what I find is that people have a hard time imagining what bystander intervention can be without some sort of a preview into the possibilities. Next one we have is delay. So this one is really just checking in with the person about what happened, and saying, hey, I saw what happened. Are you okay? Do you want me to, come with you to talk to HR? This, often in the workplace is the water cooler conversation. It's the bathroom conversation. It's pulling somebody aside and just checking in with them and seeing if they're okay. And, sometimes, particularly if it's a type of harassment that you are less familiar with, for example, if it's sexual harassment and you yourself, have never experienced sexual harassment, maybe you've never even talked to anybody about who's experienced sexual harassment, you might not know, right? Did they experience that as sexual harassment or not? Did they experience that as racialized harassment or not? If you, are a white person, for example. And so sometimes checking in can give you that information to say like, okay, yes, they did experience it as harassment. So what do we need to do next? How can I support them next? Delegate. This is another one that we often think about in the workplace. And this is, getting help from somebody else. So finding, an HR representative, reporting it to a manager. All managers are, mandated reporters. So if you are a manager and somebody reports sexual harassment to you, you are required to take action on that. Otherwise, it creates liability for your organization. So certainly, getting management involved is a viable solution here. And then lastly, documenting the harassment as it occurs. So if you're observing it right online, taking a screenshot of the harassment, collecting, writing what happened or a statement of what you witnessed as soon as possible for your records. And, keep in mind that, bystanders can report sexual harassment too. You may choose to do that. You may not know what you want to do in the moment, right? So sometimes documenting the harassment in the moment can give you options down the road. It can also give, the person being harassed help and support, because oftentimes if there are witnesses to the harassment, those witnesses' testimony inside of an investigation will be very important. All right, so those are the quick redux of the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. And, just want to quickly go through, what Hollaback has done, and continues to do trainings for nonprofits, major corporations. We've done trainings for federal and city agencies, certainly colleges, media and conferences, and law enforcement officers, including the NYPD. And we have a wide range of topics, including sexual harassment prevention in the workplace, which includes a strong bystander intervention component, but is also compliant to all of the states across the country. We also look at we have a de-escalation training. So if your team is on the front lines, maybe my first job out of college was working with mentally ill homeless adults in New York City. So we would engage them from the streets and then bring them in to help them find supportive housing. So situations like that, right, where your team is maybe on the front lines or directly working with clients and needs to learn de-escalation tactics, we train in that as well. We also do a lot around online harassment and digital security. That's particularly relevant for folks doing human rights and advocacy work. Or anything in the field of journalism tends to get a tremendous amount of harassment, or really anyone at this day and age. I think, all of us are subject to online harassment and also can be held liable for online harassment happening inside of our organizations, and very few organizations know what to do about it. We have a training to help management teams develop infrastructure inside of their organizations to address online harassment, and then we also do a digital security training. We also have trainings on self-care and resilience, which can be particularly helpful for teams that have been rocked by, allegations and reports of sexual harassment and are looking to rebuild. And then we also, have trainings around combating sexism in society, and of course, workplace intervention trainings, both for workplaces or for, bystander intervention trainings, both for workplaces and for public spaces. Just a little quote from one of our clients at Vox Media. Hollaback's bystander intervention training is a key component of Vox Media's anti-harassment initiative, and one that we found to be hugely beneficial. While there are many ways a company can try to prevent and combat harassment, equipping our managers and employees with actual tactics to intervene when they witness harassment is perhaps even more powerful. All right, and that is it from me. I'm eager to hear your questions.
Thank you. So we did ask our audience when you all registered to go ahead and shoot us some preliminary questions, and Emily covered a lot of those questions when she created her deck for you, but just a couple outstanding. I'll start to just curate these as they come in and go down the list. To start talking specifically about trainings, Emily, do you have an opinion, or does your organization have an opinion about staff providing the training versus bringing in outside contractors? Obviously, they would work in coordination with one another, but is one way better than the other? Than using an HR manager versus bringing in somebody from the outside to do these trainings?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to my knowledge, none of the laws across the country mandate who does the training. What I would say to that is that sometimes bringing in an outside trainer can be really helpful, because people will come to an outside trainer with questions that they may feel uncomfortable going directly to HR with. They may feel like it's a more neutral third party. That being said, certainly I know if you go with your HR department, that's appropriate too. If you bring in an outside trainer, what you may want to consider too is having them work specifically with your HR department to make sure that they are not just training, on a basics training, but ideally digging in and doing a customized training on the policies and procedures inside of your workplace and exactly who they would be reporting to.
Have you ever had to address buy-in at an organization? You talked early in your presentation about the difference between a training that's designed to check boxes for legal requirements and then a training that would probably be more effective actually preventing harassment, which is the goal. Have you had any instances where perhaps there's an organization or leadership with an organization or staff with an organization that just wants to check boxes and is not concerned about the prevention and how you handle that dynamic when you come in? Maybe what I'm asking is, maybe one side of the organization wants to check the box and another leader wants to actually prevent, and how you handle that situation when you enter and try to get the more robust training presented.
Yeah, in my experience, the people who are most interested in checking the boxes are people who have never had to directly manage an incident of sexual harassment in the workplace, because they are incredibly tough in a nonprofit environment, because the expectations of shared values and equity inside the workplace are so high, and the reality of sexual harassment is just that it erodes that. And many times, even after an investigation is run, the harassment, most people in the office could agree or believe that the sexual harassment happened, but it may not rise to this legal standard of harassment, and thus the employer may not feel compelled to take action or to in any way punish the harasser, and all of that can create ripple effects that ultimately are far, far, far more expensive than, frankly, the most Rolls-Royce trainer that you could possibly bring in on this issue. So what I think most people who are looking at checking boxes are not truly looking at the implications of what would happen, at the full degree of the risk of what could happen to your organization if sexual harassment was to occur and an investigation took place. I also think from in this particular moment, people are much more likely to speak out about harassment that they're facing, whereas previously most of the people who we heard who were facing harassment were simply choosing to leave their jobs without mentioning it. People do now feel more confident and comfortable coming forward with reports of sexual harassment post Me Too, especially seeing how widespread it is, how many of their favorite celebrities have experienced it and spoken out on that, and really looking towards them as role models. And inside of a nonprofit context, people are going to feel, and this is a good thing, they're going to feel more safe and comfortable coming forward with reports of harassment, because they're going to feel like they're going to be taken seriously. And I think that's puts added pressure on those of us in the nonprofit sector to really get this right. And it also means that frankly, we're going to have additional consequences if we don't.
Another advice about training, and this is going to be our last training question, and then we're going to have to get into the questions specifically about harassment in the workplace. Any advice for trainings with organizations that have multiple locations?
Yeah.
Working in a nonprofit, you can have a majority of your team in this city, and then one person here, and one person here, and one person here. Is there any best practices for making sure that everybody's included in the best possible manner?
Yeah. So the most what you're looking for is the intersection between effective and affordable. Obviously, the most effective strategy is going to be to dispatch a trainer to all 100 of your offices. The most affordable will be an e-learning, which can, tick the boxes in terms of being the right length or in terms of being interactive. What we have seen and what data proves out across all forms of training is that e-learning, well, they have made it much more dynamic in the past few years, is not as effective as having a live trainer. So what we recommend are looking at solutions just like the training you're on right now, where you do have a live trainer who can answer your exact questions, who you can interact with, who you can engage with, but you're using video conferencing or GoToWebinar or a similar platform to train folks. And that seems to have a strong, nothing's quite as good as being in the same room with folks, but it seems to be showing consistently a much stronger impact inside of organizations than, an e-learning, for example, where you're just interacting with a computer.
We do have a couple of questions about the interactions with staff and clients. One individual says they work with homeless and there's a lot of mental illness. So can you go into providing training for staff when they're dealing with harassment from the clientele?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think I mentioned, I used to work with mentally ill homeless adults, so I certainly understand, that concern. I think that, in that context, for your employees to really have clarity on what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and also to have clarity on what happens when there is unacceptable behavior, when sexual harassment does occur. What is the sequence of events that the organization will take to take care of them? And yeah, I think those pieces are incredibly important. I mentioned that the organization can be held liable for harassment that comes from clients or customers. The way that liability works is that you are held liable if you know about the harassment and you do not take action to prevent the harassment. So, for example, you may want to consider offering, if you are the person harassed is the case manager of the client, for example, consider offering that to switch that client to a different case manager, for example. Or if a client is persistently, harassing all staff, right? You would need to consider transferring them to a different, organization. So, keep things like that in mind. The other piece, and this again, it depends on the context in which you work with people. In the context I was working with people, once we engaged with them, they were in a full day of programming. So you may too want to consider training, your clients in what sexual harassment is and why it isn't okay, because certainly this is something that, if they continue that behavior, that'll have long-lasting impacts on them as individuals, as well as your team. And having those one-on-one conversations with clients when they do cross the line is also incredibly important.
Great. And also just to reiterate, we're getting a couple questions. You all will get a copy of the slide deck following the event today. And also it can be downloaded in the handout section of the GoToWebinar user interface. So Emily, I'm going to go into the next question, which I consider the Joe Biden question. What to do when either the offender doesn't get that they're offending, or in situations where there might be inappropriate action, but someone doesn't feel harassed.
Yeah.
Mr. Biden could could hug you and you're okay with it, and Mr. Biden can hug me and I would be completely over the moon. I would just, it would bother me incredibly. So how do you deal with that kind of situation and that kind of dynamic within a workplace?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because I think the reality is there certainly is a legal definition for sexual harassment, but the experience of sexual harassment is really dependent on the person who's experiencing it. And I think that if this is like a question in your workplace, I think it's important to explain to your team that people have various traumas related to sex and abuse and power. For example, we talked about 1 in 4 women have been sexually harassed in the workplace. 1 in 4 girls are sexually assaulted before the age of 18. 84% of women and 24% of men report being sexually harassed in some context throughout their lives. And in all of these situations, right, it is typically the victim who is blamed for what has happened, both by our society and our media, and oftentimes too by the people that are around them. And typically that'll look something, in a workplace like, well, but she let him put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't say anything, right? She just laughed it off, right? Which is a pretty typical response. If I was uncomfortable with Joe Biden putting his hand on my shoulder, Joe Biden is somebody who has a tremendous amount of power in this world. I might just laugh it off and step away, right? To make it stop, but not to escalate a situation. And yet when people see that, they say, well, then she asked for it when he did XYZ worse, right? And so, people are coming in with these experiences, both of trauma, abuse, assault, and the experience of being told by, the world and most of the people in it that all of that was their fault, right? And sometimes, too, especially when we think about instances of street harassment, for example, which is often one of the first ways that young people experience harassment, comments like responding to good morning, right, is seen as an invitation, right? So sometimes even these smaller things like putting your hand on somebody's shoulder can feel like they're going to escalate. They can feel like it's going to be worse. They can put you on guard based on your experiences. And the reality is not everyone has those experiences, and even people who do have those experiences may not respond with that degree of sensitivity. We are all different. We are all individuals. But the reality is that we can't know everyone's history. We can't know everyone's preferences for being touched or complimented unless we ask them. And so, it's best to err on, the side of caution. That goes for Joe Biden too. Also, I think he would be well served to learn how to do a good apology. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah. So just I think we got room for 2 more questions. A real quick one. Can you give us some examples of microaggressions?
Examples of microaggressions, yes. I think one example that pops up for me in particular that I saw in one of the early questions that came in is teasing, right? Teasing can just be teasing. It can be cute. It can be nice, but it can also be very passive aggressive, right? It can be a very passive aggressive way of reminding somebody that they are less than because they are Black, or because they are short, or because they are disabled, right? Or because they are, slow at XYZ part of their job, and that those types of teasing can show up as microaggressions. We also see instances, where people are talked over in meetings. So, an example of that would be, a woman is explaining herself and a man interjects, talks over her, talks louder than her, and interrupts. Another common example that we hear in that space is called mansplaining, right? A woman makes a point, a man makes the exact same point in slightly different words, and everyone is like, oh yeah, that guy had the right idea. So also that can be a form of microaggression. Yeah, there's a lot of different small ways. And what I want to flag about microaggressions is, look, most of us in this nonprofit sector doing this work, we have the best of intentions, we have the best values. But the reality is that we have been raised in a world that is imperfect. And as a result of that, we do have what we call implicit bias, which means we don't explicitly think that, women are sex objects, or that, people of color deserve less money in the world, right, for doing the exact same work. But we implicitly are, maybe we're a little more on guard when a man of color raises their voice compared to when a white man raises their voice, right? Because we have all these myths in our head about, men of color as aggressors and sexual predators, right? And things of that nature, right? And so we constantly have to be I think watching ourselves and watching our behavior and watching each other's behavior. And I think, what bystander intervention can do in its best spirit is start to nip some of these microaggressions in the bud by helping people become aware of things that they may be doing that they don't even realize, that can start to erode the organizational culture to a point where it creates an environment where harassment starts to make sense. Right. And so I think harassment starts to feel like an option to employees. It starts to feel like something they could get away with, something that is part of the organizational culture, if you will.
Excellent. So we're going to fit in one more because it was asked a couple of times. We're talking about the he said, she said incident, where there's no real evidence. It just becomes one person's word against the other. Can you address how to best handle that type of situation, and for the employer, from the employer side, and also from the victim side, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the he said, she said situation. So I'm assuming in this dynamic, right, that you're receiving a report of harassment, you're running an investigation, you're going to want to tell both parties the result of that, investigation, which it sounds like, the result is that it was inconclusive, that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that there was sexual harassment. And then once you've sort of done your official HR work, I think you have to do the management work of resolving this issue of safety and morale inside of your team. So, what you may want to consider on that front are offering a mediation for the alleged victim and the alleged harasser, so that they can have a mediated conversation, ideally with an external mediator, although, depending on your team and the experience of your team, internal may work as well, but an objective mediator so that they can talk to each other directly about, what happened and the intentions, behind it. You may also want to consider offering any type of reasonable accommodations to the person who was harassed. And again, reasonable, right? If their job is to be a cashier, then a reasonable accommodation may not be to work from home, for example. But offering those types of reasonable accommodations, I think, will be seen as fair by the team as a whole. We certainly know that it is uncommon for people to lie about experiences of sexual harassment because there is a personal cost that people pay when they report it. But certainly you can only take action on what you know. And then the last piece that I would consider is, oftentimes these instances become public very quickly. So what do you need to do internally? And that may be, internally you may need to bring in a facilitator and have a facilitated, conversation. You may need to. You may decide just to offer a really great sexual harassment training or bystander intervention training to your team. But you're going to want to signal to your team in some way, shape, or form that, whether or not this incident was conclusive, that you are serious about sexual harassment and you're serious about, creating a workplace that feels safe for all. And I think, the risk of not doing that is that you're going to see some of your some of your best staff and also some of your potentially staff that is most vulnerable to harassment, especially women, especially women of color, especially LGBTQ folks, start to look elsewhere for employment, which obviously has significant consequences on the organization as well. So yeah, that would be my guidance. These are tricky situations. They are rarely clean and easy to deal with.
And to follow your thought process through that, so you've had your investigation, you've had your result. What's the component for post-investigation? I mean, you said very clearly that at least it shows that your organization takes harassment seriously. But if you have you've had your investigation, the investigation has come up with whatever it's come up with. Is there a next step post-investigation that the organization needs to take as well? I mean, obviously, like you said, when these things happen, word gets out. So after you've finalized everything, which can have its own, privacy issues, is there a post-investigation or post-incident step that is taken?
Yeah, so
Company-wide?
post-investigation, it does depend on the results of the investigation, right? So if the result of the investigation is that harassment occurred, certainly you're going to want to look at punitive actions. If the result of the investigation is that it is inconclusive, right? That is not a result that you're going to share publicly with the organization. The investigations are intended to be private, and the results of the investigation are intended also to be private. So as an employer, you can't just publicly announce like no problems here, like it was inconclusive, or harassment didn't happen, like we know for certain, or whatever it is, right? You kind of have to come at it from a different angle to protect the privacy of the people involved. But you also, look, let's be realistic. Like often it is very rare that the results will actually be kept confidential between the people who are involved in it for various reasons. Somebody's going to want to show, that they were right, or somebody's going to tell their best friend or their work wife, what happened, and then, somebody gets drunk at a party and the rumor spreads, right? So I think that's where those morale issues, like a mediation, like a training, like, considering reasonable accommodations may come into play. Your legal obligation in terms of harassment is over, presumably, unless they decide to report it to one of the city, state, or federal agencies. But your management responsibilities have really just begun because of the sort of post-harassment fallout that can happen.
Great. Well, we've exhausted our time. I know we can go forever, but do you have your contact information on a slide?
I do. And this is my actual email. If you have questions and you want to email me, it's emily@hollaback.org. You can also, of course, find us all over the internet. And, let us know if you have questions. We definitely, understand, well, your position as being a nonprofit ourselves, and also, are here to not just address legal compliance, but really work to prevent sexual harassment, and do believe bystander intervention is a great solution.
Perfect. Okay, well, like we said earlier, for the audience, there are some sexual harassment dedicated questions in the post-event survey. For those of you all who work with 501c services directly through the trust, we are hoping to create some programming with Hollaback exclusively for you. So it's imperative that you let us know what you need so that we can create that program with Emily and her team. So, ma'am, thank you so much for your time today, and I appreciate everybody for joining us.